Calvinism and Arminianism are two systems of theology that attempt to explain the relationship between God's sovereignty and man's responsibility in the matter of salvation. Calvinism is named for John Calvin, a French theologian who lived from 1509 to 1564. Arminianism is named for Jacobus Arminius, a Dutch theologian who lived from 1560 to 1609. The following will be debated between these two great theologians.
Thank you for joining me today, Arminius. I have called you here to discuss the doctrine of salvation.
Yes, and I plan to rigorously defend my theology on the matter.
And I as well. So tell me, do you believe in predestination?
I certainly do. I believe that God predestined his people through his foreknowledge of their belief in him. From the beginning of time, God knew who would accept him and put their faith in him, and therefore they were predestined to salvation.
So you're saying that people are predestined to salvation through their own self-determination?
Yes, salvation comes through the free will of the individual. God offered salvation to all people through Christ's work on the cross, but it is only those who choose God that will receive this salvation. So basically, it is a sinner's choice whether or not he or she will be saved. It is not God's forcing the sinner to choose him.
But in saying that, you are denying the sovereignty of God and giving man power over God.
I confirm God's sovereignty, but I am simply saying that God limited his sovereignty by giving man free will. Are you then saying that God does not give man free will?
God is the one who makes the choice. God predestined believers, but his predestination was not a foreknowledge, but rather an election. God chose who he would save before they could do anything to deserve it. There is nothing anyone can do to deserve salvation, and therefore God is not obligated to save anyone.
So then, if God chooses the elect, then doesn't he choose the damned as well? How can a loving and merciful God choose to damn his own people?
Well, you are not seeing the full picture of God's goodness. It is so much greater than our own goodness that we cannot completely comprehend it. God allows some to enter into damnation because he is a God of justice. And in showing these acts of justice, God's glory is revealed to us. We should recognize God's mercy through his choice to save the elect and see his glory through the justice carried out upon those whom he did not choose.
But Christ's sacrifice on the cross is sufficient enough to display his wrath and the justice to the world. His glory was fulfilled through the sacrifice.
Obviously, it was not completely sufficient if people are still falling into damnation. God's justice must continue in order for his full glory to be revealed and his whole plan to be fulfilled. In addition to this, Christ's redemption on the cross was meant for his elect and ultimately secured their salvation. His death did not ensure the salvation of everyone.
I do agree that Christ's death did not ensure the salvation of everyone. However, the opportunity of salvation was offered to everyone. His death made it possible for anyone to be saved, but only those who accepted it actually received it.
But how can you proclaim that God's grace can be rejected? Once again, you are giving man a power over God. If salvation is based on the acceptance or rejection of God's grace, then you are limiting God's work of salvation. Rather, a person can reject God's external call to grace, but once God calls him internally, then grace cannot be rejected.
The Spirit cannot do an internal work in man unless The Spirit cannot do eternal work in man unless man allows him to. Therefore, God's grace cannot have an eternal effect on a person, thus it can be resisted.
You continue to stress the point of salvation depending on man, but you appear to be denying Scripture in doing so. Romans 3 talks about how no one seeks after God, but must first be elected by God. Man is in total depravity from the fall, and therefore has the inability to save himself through his own belief. Because man's will has been overtaken by sin, it is impossible for him to choose good over evil. The work of the Spirit is thus required for man to be saved.
I still continue my defense of man being able to experience free will. God's grace assists us in choosing him and enables our free will. Because of this, we are able to choose good over evil.
Unfortunately, my points seem to not be getting through to you. So rather than continuously repeating myself, I am going to accept that we are never going to come to an agreement. God has the ultimate answers, and one day in eternity, he will reveal to us the truth.
Well, it seems that we can agree on one thing after all. Looks as though we must agree to disagree.
It is interesting to note the diversity of the different viewpoints of Calvin and Arminian. Ultimately, it is our view that both systems fail in the attempt to explain what cannot be explained. These two arguments seem as if they contradict one another, but to God, they make sense. Yes, God is absolutely sovereign and knows all, and we as Christians are to make the choice to walk down the path of righteousness because through our salvation, we should have the desire to do so.